my dear UPSC and NPSC aspirants. Welcome to the Hindu Daily Editorial and Current Affairs Analysis. Today, we will be covering 5th July 2026 and the 6th July 2026 news together. Moving on, first we will look into 5th July 2026. So the themes for the 5th July 26 are ranging from economy, sectors of economy, all the way to society and social justice, and to history and culture. From the front page, we see four important news. One is about India navigating the West Asia crisis. Second, about the Chinese investments inflow, which are good for the wider ties between India and China. Third, about designation of 23 persons as terrorists under Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And then, essential medicines list has been unrevised for the past 4 years. Now, moving on to Indian economy. So the first is about the West Asia energy shock. And at a HPCL Rajasthan refinery inauguration program at Balotra, Prime Minister Modi has said that India has weathered the West Asia crisis through the domestic resources and the diplomacy, and thereby avoided the fuel rationing. And he also pointed out the state-run oil marketing companies have absorbed the losses to the tune of 75,000 crore rupees in the June end quarter. And as a consequence, the LPG rates have been kept at 950 rupees for the general consumers and for at 650 rupees for Ujjwala consumers, beneficiaries. And the urea is at 300 rupees a bag, and the petrol and diesel are unrationed. So the trigger was the mid 2026 Iran-Israel escalation that threatened the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a choke point through which one-fifth of the crude oil resources of the world passes through. And India imports roughly 88% of its crude. So any disruption in the Gulf will have a direct impact on the prices when it comes to the LPG, petrol, and everything related to the energy crisis, prices. So it will also have an impact on the increase in the subsidy bill. So energy security is reframed here as a public finance because we are talking about 75,000 crores of the losses which the oil marketing companies have absorbed. So the administered price mechanism which is followed in India had shielded the consumers and contained the headline inflation. But the cost did not vanish. It just shifted onto the oil marketing companies' balance sheets as a cost of fiscal subsidy. It shows that the state using the public sector firms as shock absorbers to keep the prices politically manageable. So the way forward is to ensure the durable insulation, we need structural cushions in forms of having larger strategic petroleum reserves, and the crude sourcing must be diversified beyond the Gulf regions and faster refining and the renewables rather than repeated one-off absorption that erodes the oil marketing companies' capacity to invest. So from Main's angle, this is important from how energy security is an fiscal management challenge, and then we can see about the administered prices and the uh, fiscal cost, which is there on the oil marketing companies as a result of this, and the vulnerability because of the certain choke points like Hormuz, and what is the case for this enlarging the strategic petroleum reserves and diversification of the oil sources. Then let us look at the domestic refining as insulation against the crude shocks. Prime Minister Modi credited the domestic refiners for raising the LPG output through the crisis and pledged continued capacity expansion. He stated uh, that the state government delayed the Baltora project earlier. The former state government had delayed the Baltora project earlier, and a fire in its crude distillation unit a day before the planned 22nd April date has pushed the inauguration further to July. So, HRRL is India's first integrated greenfield refinery petroleum complex in Baltora and adding both the fuel and the petrochemical feedstock. So this points at the self-sufficiency of India. It lets India import cheaper crude and process it at home itself instead of importing the costlier finished products. So the refining capacity converts dependence on the volatile crude into a value-added domestic output and the export potential. And this is a strategic buffer for India. And the delayed timeline shows how the center-state frictions and the execution can blunt the infrastructure meant to be a national cushion. So the way forward is to insulate such kind of project timelines from the political transition and de-risk the mega projects with reference to the safety, land and the clearances, and integrate the refining with the petrochemicals and step into green hydrogen to deepen the energy buffer further. Now, come from a mains angle, so the refining self-sufficiency is a hedge against the imported crude oil shocks. So the political economy of the project delays, and the center-state cooperation in the strategic infrastructure is a very important angle to look at from mains perspective. Then let us look at the sectors of the economy. So coming to this one, India takes its first commercial step into the chip hardware. Prime Minister Modi inaugurated uh, a semi-outsourced semiconductor assembly and test facility at the Sanand, Gujarat. So it is under the India Semiconductor Mission. It is built with partners from Thailand and Japan, and the foundation stone of this was laid in 2024, and testing began in 2025, and the commercial production has begun. The capacity is about to produce about 20 crore chips a year and scaling towards a 500 crore chips, uh, which equals to about 1.5 crore a day. The context is chip making has three stages. One is designing the chips and the fabrication, and then the assembly, testing, and the packaging. So, which is the facility which the Prime Minister had inaugurated just now, which is outsourced semiconductor assembly and testing. So India is strong in design but has no commercial fabrication facilities yet. So OSAT is a realistic entry point into the value chain of the semiconductors. So they're capturing the back-end values and the jobs. So this is India's first commercial move into the semiconductor manufacturing hardware. So building an ecosystem, skilling, and having a supplier base while trimming the reliance on the East Asian economies, especially Taiwan, will matter a lot for India. So the OSAT sits lower in the value chain than the fabrication. However, genuine self-reliance still needs fabrication facilities to open up. These are far costlier and the technology is gated in this. So way forward is to move up the chain. So by starting fabrication facilities and the deepen the materials and the equipment supplies and secure the design talent and the intellectual property rights associated with it and treat this OSAT clusters, which is outsourced semiconductor assembly and test facility clusters, as a stepping stone and not the destination, because we need to make India a developed country by 2047, as per the Viksit Bharat. So the mains angle perspective, India's placement in the global semiconductor value chain. So what is there as of now? What India is aiming to achieve? Those things are necessary to be seen. And what are the difference between the back end and front end when it comes to the semiconductor industry and the industrial policy, skilling and the strategic technology self-reliance are important points to ponder upon. Next, let us look at the novel biologics brought under the central licensing. So the advanced stem cell and the gene therapies are being brought under the Central License Approving Authority framework via the amendments to the drug rules of 1945. The reference point is the NextCar 19 in India's indigenous CAR T cell therapy as per the Immuno Act 2023. Now, these are novel biologics which are based on the living cells and gene editing. Unlike the chemical generics, India's regulator when it comes to drugs and cosmetics is generally focused on the chemical generic medicines. So bringing this biologics under the CLAA, which is the Central License Approving Authority, centralizes the oversight over their manufacturing and the quality for the fast emerging class of the personalized medicine. So the centralized licensing brings the consistency and the safety oversight to the cutting edge therapies. What we need to keep in mind is it is not automatic approval, nor does it make these therapies cheaper or more accessible. So, CAR T remains a very expensive treatment, but nonetheless, a generics oriented regulator must now build the capacity for the personalized biologics, that is, tailor made medicine. So, the way forward is to develop the regulatory expertise for the cell and the gene products and create affordability pathways through public funding, domestic manufacturing like the NextCap 19, and price negotiation, and balance speed of the access with rigorous safety mechanisms for irreversible gene interventions. From a mains perspective, regulating these biologics with a generics era framework, uh, what are the opportunities and the challenges that are going to be there? On one hand, we have to ensure the access to this personalized medicine. At the same time, what are the safeguards that need to be put in place? Otherwise, the negative impacts it could have in terms of the germline editing and the affordability of the personalized medicine itself. That means rich will have the access to these kind of medicines, which will make them better placed compared to the poor. Let us look at the polity, governance, and the legislation. So, first is about one nation, one election, and the concerns of the federalism. So, a conclave of the eminent citizens have rejected the one nation, one election proposal, arguing that the simultaneous Lok Sabha and the assembly polls undermine the federalism of India. Ashok Lavasa, who was a former election commissioner, raised the electoral rule, that is, the special intensive revision concerns, and G.K. Pillai had flagged the caste census debate. The participants also questioned treating the passport as just a travel document and the burden of proof issues in the citizenship. Now, the context is a one nation, one election seeks to synchronize the national and the state elections, and this is backed by a high level committee and a constitutional amendment bills. The critics see it as re-centralizing the electoral calendar in a federal and asymmetric polity. That the core tension is federalism versus the administrative efficiency. The simultaneous polls could cut the costs and add the permanent campaign mode, but may nationalize the state elections and dilute the regional accountability and force premature dissolution or the extension of the assemblies. So this touches a basic feature question of the federal balance. So the broad political consensus is required, and the firm constitutional safeguards must be kept in place for the state's autonomy, and clear rules must be put in place for the midterm dissolutions, which are uh, the basic requirements. The efficiency gains, on one hand, must be weighed honestly against the costs the federalism will have. Because the Supreme Court of India had also declared federalism as one of the parts of the basic features of the Indian Constitution. Now, from Main's angle, what is the impact of the one nation, one election on the federal structure of India? And uh, efficiency gains, which we will get because of the one nation, one election, versus the federal autonomy on the other hand. The constitutional amendment routes and the basic structure limits all need to be pondered upon. Next, let us see the center has asked Telegram to take proactive action against the channels which are sharing the pirated content, invoking intermediary duties. So this engages Rule 31B of the IT Rules of 2021, which is the agencies like the Telegram or the intermediaries should exercise due diligence, and the Section 79, which is the Safe Harbor clause of the IT Act, with the platform treated as a significant social media intermediary. So the context is the Safe Harbor shields the intermediaries from the liability for the user content only if they exercise the due diligence and act on notice. The state is nudging these platforms from reactive takedown towards a proactive policing of the piracy. So this test tests the limit of the intermediary accountability as to how much proactive monitoring can be demanded without turning the platforms into the sensors or breaking their models. It signals a tightening compliance environment for messaging apps operating in India with safe harbor as a pressure point. So the way forward is having clear and proportionate obligations and transparency on the takedowns and a balance between the intellectual property enforcement on one side and the creator's right on the one side. And overblocking, privacy, and the free speech risks are the third dimension. So all these need to be balanced with the predictable rules for the intermediaries, which are the social media platforms. So the main angle is intermediary accountability on one hand versus the safe harbor clause under the IT rules, and discuss both the pros and cons of it, and uh, what are the pain points or the challenges which we have, and having a proactive monitoring and how it is going to affect the free speech and the privacy trade-offs, and the duty of the intermediaries to protect the intellectual property rights. Then Ministry of Home Affairs had designated 23 individuals comprising 6 Indians and 17 Pakistanis, including a Bengaluru origin engineer, as terrorists under Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So all the named operate from the Pakistan or Pak occupied Kashmir. The total of the individuals who are designated as terrorists stand at 80, and with links cited to the Rameshwaram Cafe blast. So, the 2019 Unlawful Activity Prevention Act amendment empowered the government to designate individuals, not just the organizations, as terrorists. So, the designation carries reputational and operational consequences, but has drawn due process criticism. While the tool strengthens the counter-terror signaling and international pressure, yet the individual designation power raises the rule of law questions because there is limited judicial review before the listing and the burden on the accused to seek denotification and the scope for overreach. So, the way forward is to have time bound and robust review mechanisms, transparent evidentiary standards, and effective delisting procedures which would reconcile the security aims with the due process and the civil liberty safeguards which are guaranteed by the Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. So, from a mains angle, what we need to see is like what are the implications of the individual terror designation under UAPA on the security effectiveness versus the due process and the judicial review on the other hand. Next, let us look at the international relations. So, India's ambassador to China, Vikram Doraiswamy, said that the greater Chinese investment flow would benefit the wider ties between India and China and pitched more Indian pharma exports to China. Uh, so, the bilateral trade hit is 151.1 billion in the 2025-26, but the India's deficit with China stands at 112.16 billion. So after Galwan clashes between India and China, India has tightened the scrutiny of the Chinese foreign direct investments, even as the trade dependence had deepened. So the lopsided balance in terms of large imports from China and modest exports to the China is a structural sore point the New Delhi wants to narrow down. So, the comments of Indian ambassador signals cautious economic re-engagement and realignment while welcoming the investments in terms of the jobs and supply chains and seeking the market access for the pharma products of India and managing a strategic rivalry and the border tensions on the other hand. So the pharma pitch directly targets the deficit by seeking entry into the market that protects its own industry. So the way forward is to have a calibrated opening through investment in the non-sensitive sectors with security screening in the first place and pressing the China for the market access in the pharma and the IT products and then diversifying the India's own supply chains. So on the other hand, we need to keep the border question firewall from the trade. That means both need to be separated from one another. From a mains angle, what we need to see is managing the economic interdependence with a strategic rival about the trade deficit between India and China and the screening of the FDI and what implications it is going to have in the broader India China relations and the market access asymmetry between India and China. Then we see that India has signaled that taking a mediator role in the West Asia conflict will not benefit India, and India had declined to step in as a peace broker. So India holds deep and balanced stakes across the West Asia, especially with the Gulf countries in energy, and India has ties with both Israel and Iran. And India had developed the Chabahar port in the Iran, and India has a large diaspora living in the Gulf regions. So the formal mediation would force visible alignment in a conflict where India benefits from strategic ambiguity. So the stance reflects the strategic autonomy and the risk aversion of the Indian diplomacy. While mediation offers little upsides, there are large downsides to India, such as alienating the partners and owning any failure. So India prefers quiet diplomacy that protects concrete interests, like in terms of energy, citizens, and trade routes, over the prestige-seeking interventions. So the way forward is to continue issue-based and issue-based and low-profile diplomacy and protect the energy and the diaspora interests of India and use the balanced ties for the humanitarian or the back channel roles rather than be part of a formal mediation exercise. So, from a mains angle, uh, uh, it is important from the perspective of the strategic autonomy in the West Asia crisis for India and what are the costs and benefits of having a mediator role for India and how does India balance its energy, diaspora, and the partnerships in the Gulf countries or the West Asia. Next, we see the United States Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, had struck down the Executive Order 14160 that sought to limit the birthright citizenship and upholding the principle just soli. Just soli and just sanguinem are the two principles when it comes to citizenship. Just soli means anyone who is born on the soil of the US is citizen by default. And just sanguine is like if your parents by descent, you will get the citizenship by descent. That is just sanguinis. So just solely under the 14th Amendment of 1868, reaffirming that the citizenship by birth on US soil. So the 14th Amendment of the to the Constitution of the US citizenship clause arose from the post-slavery repudiation of the Dred Scott ruling alongside the 13th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of the 1866. So the birthright citizenship is thus woven into America's constitutional settlement on equality. So it's in the judgment of the Supreme Court of United States is a landmark reaffirmation that the executive action cannot override a constitutional guarantee, and as a comparative civics mirror, it contrasts with India's trajectory from just solely towards more conditional descent-linked citizenship, a useful reference for the debates on the documentation and the burden of proof. So the comparative lesson is citizenship frameworks balance inclusion, identity and security, and the constitutional entrenchment while protecting the rights from transient executive majorities. So, this is directly relevant to India's own citizenship debates. Now, from a mains angle, we have to see birthright citizenship versus the descent based citizenship. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the both? And then the constitutional entrenchment, that is a philosophy of the constitution, versus the executive action on the other hand. So it will give us a very important reminder or a important reminder to have a comparison with India's own citizenship debates. Let us look at science and technology. So the Large Hadron Collider, which answers the fundamental, which is an experimental collider used for addressing the fundamental questions of the physics, have shut down for an $1.5 billion high luminosity upgrade to sharply raise its collision rate. So the longer term CERN-WAIS, the future circular collider with 91 kilometers of radius, about $19 billion of investment, with a decision taken around 2028 to whether to genuinely build or abandon the question for the next generation physics. So the 27-kilometer large hadron collider discovered by the Higgs boson in 2012. Uh, the higher luminosity means more collisions and access to rarer events, thus extending the discovery potential, and the future circular collider would be a far larger successor. This captures the big science's dilemma that enormous cost and decades long horizons against the uncertain and the non applied returns amid the priorities which are competing in nature. And coming to India, it is a member of the CERN, associate member, with stakes in participation, technology spin-offs, and training. So the decision shapes the global physics agenda, where India also is part of it. So the way forward is cost sharing internationally and clear articulation of the scientific case studies and honest weighing of the spin-off benefits in terms of computing, superconducting magnets, medical technology against the opportunity cost, which will decide whether the future circular collider will proceed. Then, from a mains perspective, how funding the big science have huge upfront costs versus the long-term return horizons, and what is whether investing such kind of costs is warranted or at the same time, are the returns which we get for such kind of investment is worth it? Then we need to see about international collaboration in physics and the big science and India's take in the frontier physics. Next, continuing from the news which we had seen on 4th of July 2026, uh, Rifu AI, which is China's AI model GLM 5.2, which is an open weight Chinese model, is being called a DeepSeek moment as it is approaching the US systems in capability while being released with open weights. So the open weight means a trained model parameters which are downloadable, so anyone can run or adapt the model. So following DeepSeek, it shows the Chinese labs are reaching near frontier capabilities and distributing it widely and cheaply. While the open releases diffuse the capability globally, the pressures closed US companies on the price and access. And it complicates the export control strategy because weights are public and software cannot be recalled. And it tilts the geopolitics of the AI towards the diffusion which the China is following rather than the control. So way forward is the policy must weigh what is the risk of the proliferation of the AI against the innovation benefits. For India, open models will lower the entry costs and strengthen the case for building domestic compute models and safety evaluation capacity rather than depending on any single provider. So from mains angle, what are the advantages of an open AI versus a closed AI and the diffusion of the frontier capability? The export controls when it comes to the AI, and what is India's strategic technology posture in AI. Next, let us look at once released, the software cannot be recalled. That is the dilemma when it comes to the frontier AIs. So the America's dilemma over having encaged artificial intelligence models and the open frontier models, whether to keep the most capable models closed and controlled or to release them. So uh, we have seen this in case of the uh, uh, Fable class of AI frontier model, which was developed by Claude, where on safety grounds, the US Commerce Department have expressed the concerns and ensured that uh, the full capabilities of the model should not be made available to the non-US citizens. So the most capable models are generally dual use. Dual use means while they can be used for the good, they can also be equally weaponized to use for something bad. For example, highly valuable yet potentially misusable. Example in the cyber crimes or in the biological terrorism. Keeping them caged limits the misuse but conceals ground to the open competitors, and releasing them spreads the benefits and the risks alike. So this is the central trade-off when it comes to the AI governance, safety and controls on one hand, and openness and competitiveness on the other. Once a rival releases an open frontier model like GLM 5.2, unilateral caging may forfeit the influence which US may be having without reducing the global risk, since the capability exists anyway. Unlike a physical weapon, release software cannot be unreleased. So the way forward is to have a layered governance structure which will focus on safety testing and staged release and international coordination on genuinely dangerous capabilities and having export controls calibrated to what actually restricts the misuse rather than having a blanket ban or blanket caging. So then from a main angle, governing the dual use AI, what are the safeguards need to be put in place? On one hand, the safety and security concerns versus the openness, the advantages and the disadvantages of it, and the rising competitiveness between the open models as well as the closed frontier AI models. And what are the limits of the export controls on the software? These are important from Main's perspective. Then let us look at the society and the social justice. So, a civil society working group had flagged that the National List of Essential Medicines, having 384 drugs, has not been revised since the year 2022, while the WHO model lists 523 drugs and was updated in 2023 and 2025. And as a result, this has left the newer cancer and the diabetes drugs outside the capped price protection. So, the National List of Essential Medicine inclusions lets the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority to cap the prices under the drug price control order, keeping the essential drugs affordable. So, a list which is old means that recent and often costly therapies are out of the price control and it will hit the patients who need them the most. So, while the lag is the lag in this policy is health equity and the right to life issue because affordability of the essential medicines is part of the right to health. So, and Supreme Court had in the past declared that the right to live uh, a life with uh, having better quality of life itself. is part of the right to life. So an outdated list quietly excludes the modern treatments from the affordability net and thus widens the access gaps between those who can pay and those who cannot. So the way forward is to institutionalize a periodic and time-bound national list of essential medicines revision and align them with the therapeutic advances and the updates which are brought by the World Health Organization, and thus extend the price control to the high burden new drugs and strengthen the link between the listed public procurement. So the main angle is access to the essential medicines as a right under Article 21 and right to life. And then price control, periodic revision, and bridging in the health equity. Next is the ICC uh, issued a return to play guidelines so that the motherhood and the elite cricket are not mutually exclusive. So the International Cricket Council built this around a 6-hour framework that supports the players through and after the pregnancy. So the context is elite women athletes have long faced a career versus motherhood bind, where a pregnancy can mean losing the contracts, fitness, and selection. So a structured return to play policy institutionalizes support instead of leaving it to the temporary goodwill of the teams. So it tackles the motherhood penalty in the professional sports and the models of workplace maternity support more broadly, and it signals maturing women's cricket and the gender equity norms, though India's boards still lack the comparable board level policy in these matters. Coming to the way forward, the national board should adopt and fund the such frameworks with the paid maternity contracts, childcare, and the phased fitness return, and extend the principle to other sports and workspaces to shrink the motherhood penalty. So this is quite important from the perspective of the gender equality and gender equity in the professional sports. And what is motherhood penalty? This term is very, very important. And where are the what are the other sectors where we see motherhood penalty in India? And institutionalizing the maternity support beyond what is there in the Maternity Benefit Act of 1971. Then let us look at the history and the culture. So a piece profiles Aung San Suu Kyi as the Myanmar's jailed pro-democracy icon, as the military junta in the uh, Myanmar seeks legitimacy while she remains imprisoned since the 2021 coup that ousted her NLD government. Aung San Suu Kyi was a Nobel Peace Laureate and daughter of the independence hero of Myanmar, Aung San, and she led the NLD's democratic opening, but her standing was tarnished by her defense of the military over the 2017 Rohingya atrocities. So the 2021 coup gave rise to parallel national unity government and the armed resistance. So why it matters is her arc embodies the Myanmar's contested democratization and the limits of the icon-centered politics, and the country's current instability directly affects the India's northeastern region, especially the borders, the refugees, and the insurgent sanctuaries, and the Kaladan multimodal transport and transit project, uh, which is considered to be a highway for the IMT, India-Myanmar Thailand trilateral highway. So it feeds the China versus the democracies contest for the influence. So India balances engaging with the military junta on security, connectivity, and countering China with support for the democratic forces and management of the refugees and the borders below us. And a stable and inclusive settlement remains distant in Myanmar. So from Main's angle, the Myanmar's democratic struggle and what is its impact on the India, because India is in the neighborhood of Myanmar, and democratic values on one hand and strategic and pragmatic interests or the real politic on the other hand. And it also highlights the potential security spillovers which the northeastern India might have due to this kind of military governance, and where China and other countries will be seeking to contest for influence in Myanmar. These questions, which can be seen on basis of 5th of July's newspaper is energy security is increasingly a public finance question, not just a supply question. Examined in the light of India's management of the West Asia crisis of 2026, simultaneous elections promise efficiency, but risk the federal compact. Critically evaluate one nation, one election proposal. Then discuss the challenges of conducting economic diplomacy with a strategic rival that is also a country's largest trading partner with reference to India-China ties. Then finally, in an era of the export controls on advanced chips, open-weight AI models blur the line between openness and control. Discuss the strategic implications for India. Next, let us move on to the news of 6th of July 2026. So the agenda for 6th July 26 are it ranges from environment and ecology, economy, polity, international relations, all the way to security and disaster management, and finally history and culture. So the front page shows four important news. Meta, the parent organization of Facebook, Meta, was told to disable child sex abuse content by IT Ministry, and then US Department of Justice seeks to drop charges against Adani to avoid diplomatic strife, and then 25,865 crore has been released under the VBG scheme, and emergency gas curbs are eased as the liquefied natural gas normalizes. Now coming to environment and ecology. So a study in the scientific reports with the ICR and DRI has shown that between the data from Haryana between 2004 and 19, heat stress can cut the milk yields by 20 to 30% and resulted in an estimated loss of 3.2 million tons of milk, which is worth 2,661 crore, and a figure which could reach up to 15 million tons by the 2050s. So the buffaloes are worst hit by the increasing heat stress, and the indigenous breeds like Sahiwal and the Haryana prove to be more resilient. The context is dairy is India's largest agriculture subsector and a key rural livelihood, especially for the small landless and the women-headed households. So the rising heat and humidity depress the feed intake, leading to fertility and depress the feed intake, reduction in the fertility, and milk letdown in the animals. So this matters because it reframes the climate change as livelihood and nutritional crisis, not just an environmental crisis. So the hit falls on the poorest of the poor in the rural areas and on the protein security, and it shows the value of the hardy indigenous breeds over the high yielding but heat sensitive crossbreeds bought from the other countries. So the way forward is to promote the heat resilient indigenous breeds and go for selective breeding and having cooling and shelter and feed management systems and weather indexed livestock insurance, and finally integrating the dairy into climate adaptation planning. So from a mains angle, climate change as a livelihood crisis can be one of the livelihood crisis with respect to the dairy development is the question which can be seen, and how the heat stress and the dairy economy gets affected, and what need to be done for the adaptation, and the case for the indigenous breeds. Next, we look at the solid waste management rules of 2026. So the Solid Waste Management Rules 2026, which have become effective from 1st of April 26, mandate 100% source segregation and introduction of the environmental compensation on the polluter pay principle, and tightens the obligations on the waste generators and the urban local bodies. So the Indian cities generate large volumes of mixed municipal waste, and this is due to the poor segregation, which cripples the recycling and the composting and feeds legacy landfills mostly. So the 2026 rules strengthen the 2016 framework with the sharper enforcement levers. So it matters because the environmental compensation operationalizes the polluter pay principle, shifting the cost onto the polluters and creating a financial deterrent. But the success of it will depend less on the rules rather than on the urban local bodies' processing capacity and the household behavioral change and decentralized handling of the waste. So the way forward is to fund and build the urban local body processing capacity, incentivize the household segregation, and extend and strengthen the extended producer responsibility when it comes to packaging and remediate the legacy dump sites. So, from a mains angle, this can be important from polluter pay principle in the waste governance. And in the past, we have seen that
polluter pay principle was actively used by the Supreme Court of India when it comes to the Vellore Citizen Forums case and several environmental um, uh, cases, which have led to development of environmental jurisprudence in India. And we can also look at the source segregation and the urban local bodies capacity and the circular economy. Next, let us look at the economy. So, the center has withdrew most provisions of the Natural Gas Supply Regulation Order 2026, which was invoked on the 9th of March under the Essential Commodities Act, as the liquefied natural gas shipments through the Strait of Hormuz has resumed after a ceasefire. So, India imports about 88% of its crude and about half of its natural gas needs. So the order was issued because it was an emergency measure to ration and prioritize the scarce gas resources during the West Asia's disruption, and its rollback signals normalization of the energy supply as a Hormuz choke point reopened. It shows that the state's toolkit for the energy emergencies through statutory rationing powers and how quickly import dependent supply swings with the geopolitics. So the heavy reliance on one choke point remains the structural vulnerability for India. So the way forward is to diversify the gas sourcing and the routes and expand the storage and the strategic reserves and accelerate the domestic exploration and the extending of the gas grid and push for the renewable transition to cut the choke point exposure. From a mains perspective, managing the energy supply emergencies uh, through the statutory rationing powers and reduce the import dependency and increase diversification when it comes to the energy are the important themes to ponder upon. Next, we see that drawing on an Comptroller and Auditor General report of 2024-25, analysts note that the Uttar Pradesh government's revenue surplus of 59,327 crores stem largely from underspending, about 27% of the budgeted capital outlay, which went unspent rather than from the stronger finances. So, a revenue surplus normally signals fiscal health. But when it arises because the planned capital development investment in terms of roads, schools, and assets were not executed, the surplus is really a symptom of weak spending and the absorptive capacity. So, this is a caution against reading the headline fiscal numbers, uh, without understanding it in totality. So the underspending on capital outlay means the foregone opportunity cost when it comes to development and the jobs, and the quality of the surplus matters more than the size of the surplus. And it points to weak project pipelines in the states. So way forward is to strengthen the project preparation and the execution and build the capacity of the department to spend the capital budgets and judge the fiscal performance by the outcomes and asset creation rather than the surplus figures itself. So it is from mains angle, we have to see how reading the fiscal indicators should be done critically, not just naively, and how the capital outlay underspending and the development uh, has an interplay between each other, and what is the state's absorb what it indicates about the state's capacity to absorb the investments altogether. Then we will see the sectors of the economy. So, VBGRAMG, which is Viksit Bharat Guarantee for Rozgar Act, which has replaced the Manrega from 1st of July, with the center releasing 25,863 crore as a first installment. So UP has received the highest of this first installment. It emphasized on planned rural infrastructure through Viksit Gram Panchayat plan, and which is mapped on ISRO's Yukt Dhara GIS and PM Gati Shakti portal. And the states have to fund almost 40% of the scheme's cost. So Manrega was a demand-driven legal guarantee of the wage employment, and it was a rights-based safety net. On the other hand, VBG shifts towards centrally designed and planned asset creation, and it changes the model from entitlement to just a program. This raises the important question of fiscal federalism and rights of the people about the right to work, and moving away from the demand-driven guarantee to a supply plan scheme. It may improve the asset quality, but can weaken the safety net function which Manrega used to provide during the distress. And 40% of the state's share plus the central design tilts the power towards the center, and also puts additional burden on the states. So the way forward will be to preserve a demand responsive floor for the distress employments and clarify the state's capacity for the 40% share and ensure GIS planned assets actually reach the neediest panchayats and protect the wage seekers' entitlements. So from an mains angle, how Manrega to VB Jairamji have moved from a right-based guarantee to just a plan-based scheme, and what is the impact it is going to have on the fiscal federalism and the rural safety nets on one hand, and the asset creation on the other hand. So, looking at the new national pension system rules, which cut the mandatory annuitization at the retirement from 40% to just 20%, letting the subscribers withdraw up to 80% of the amount as lump sum, and introduce a retirement income scheme and the tax treatment reference sections under the Section 10(12)(a). So, National Pension System is a defined contributory pension scheme, and annuitization converts the accumulated corpus into a lifelong pension. So more lump sum flexibility gives the subscribers the choice, but shifts the longevity risk onto the people. So the trade-off is flexibility on one hand versus the old age income security on the other. So the larger lump sums help those with other plans, but risk the retirees exhausting the savings and facing the insecurity across the longer lifespans. So this is the policy tension generally seen in the core pension plans. So then the way forward is while we are pairing the flexibility, uh, we also need to ensure the financial literacy safeguards and well-priced annuity or the retirement income scheme options and sensible defaults which protect against the longevity risks for the retirees. So the choice does not translate into the old age poverty. So the pension design must be flexible on one hand versus longevity or the income security on the other hand, and the defined contribution schemes uh, 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 versus the old age protection scheme must need to be seen. Next, let us look at the polity governance and legislation. The IT Ministry had directed Meta to disable the ads and the content which is facilitating access to the child sexual abuse material on Instagram and sought an explanation within 7 days, backed by the IT Act of 2000 and the IT rules of 2021, and non-compliance can cost Meta the safe harbor protection. So the I4C coordinates and rules require 24-hour removal of the posts. So the uh, as on date, the platforms enjoy the safe harbor only when they follow due diligence. So the child sexual uh, abuse material is a strict liability area where the state expects the proactive detection and rapid takedown by the platforms and not merely reactive response. So this is a strong assertion of the platform accountability for the child safety and using the safe harbor withdrawal as a leverage. And uh, this order tests the platform's proactive moderation duties and the balance between automated detection, privacy, and overblocking. So the way forward is to have robust proactive detection like hashing and use of artificial intelligence for detection and faster reporting via I4C and transparency and audits need to be put in place. Transparency standards and audits need to be put in place, and international cooperation is equally important while safeguarding the privacy and avoiding the collateral censorship altogether. So, from Main's point of view, this highlights in the GS paper 2 platform accountability for the child safety on one hand, and safe harbor as a political leverage tool, as a leverage tool by the government, and proactive moderation by the intermediaries versus the concerns of the privacy. Then, uh, another news shows that a special intensive revision of Odisha's electoral rolls left about 20 lakh names out of the draft list. So the final roll is due on 6th of September with appeals which are available under the Section 24 of the Representation of the People's Act 1950. So the special intensive revision is an intensive door-to-door verification means to clean the rolls of the duplicate and ineligible entries and large-scale deletions, however, raise the concerns about the wrongful exclusion of the genuine voters. So the tension is role purity on one hand versus the right to vote on the other. Cleaning the rolls strengthen the electoral integrity, but mass deletions risk disenfranchising the poor people, the migrants, and the marginalized who struggle with the documentation in the appeals and a due process concern is necessary for the democracy's base. So the way forward is well-publicized appeal window under the Section 24, and a proactive re-verification of the deletions need to be done, and accessible grievance redressal mechanisms need to be put in place, and so the purification of the rules does not become a cause for exclusion from the rules. So from a mains angle, this highlights about the electoral roll revision to ensure the integrity of the rules on one hand versus the people citizens' right to vote. So and it also highlights the risk of disenfranchisement and the due process. And it is seen in the recent experience that the once the uh, name is removed from the special intensive revision, it is being linked to the government schemes and benefits as well. So, considering that, and the due process need to be followed following the constitutional principles. Next, we see two threads. One is about the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill, which is dubbed as the dismissal bill, examined by the Joint Parliamentary Committee, chaired by the Aparajita Sarangi, which enables a removal of the ministers or the CMs detained on serious criminal charges, and an RTI question over whether Ram Temple Trust is a public authority under the transparency law. So, the 130th Amendment Bill would allow the removal of the minister or the chief minister detained on serious charges for a set period, raising the concerns about the misuse and the presumption of innocence. So, the RTI thread tests the boundary of what counts as a public authority. Both touch on accountability on one hand and the inbuilt safeguards on the other hand. Automatic removal on detention could deter criminality in the high office, but it risks weaponization against the opposition before the conviction. So the RTA coverage debates uh, it defined how far the public accountability will reach over the quasi-public trusts. So the way forward is while ensuring the drafting is careful with the judicial safeguards in place and some certain time limits need to be put in place and the reinstatement provisions for the amendment. And at the same time, we need to have a clear criteria for what falls under public authority and does not under the Right to Information Act to preserve the transparency without the overreach. So, from a mains angle, removing the charged office holders, how does it promote accountability on one hand, and how presumption of innocence on the other hand it gets affected when just on detention it can be used for targeting the there are fears of targeting the opposition leaders. Then we also see about what is the definition of a public authority altogether when it comes to the Right to Information Act, and what is the reach of the RTI or the quasi public bodies. Then uh, we go to the case of uh, in Maharashtra a defection loophole under the anti-defection law. So the Maharashtra case exposes the grey areas in the 10th schedule, that is the anti-defection law, where the presiding officer exemption and the merger provision illustrated by the figures like Sachin Ahir and Subhash Desai's umbilical cord remark shows that allow the defection like moves to escape disqualification. For example, the 10th schedule disqualifies the defectors, but its exceptions are two-third merger and presiding officer's discretion and long delays in deciding the petitions. These have been exploited to legitimize the splits without penalty. So it matters because it shows the anti-defection law failing its purpose of stability and fidelity to the mandate of the people because the speaker or the chairpersons can delay or shield the decisions and the mergers rebrand the defection altogether. This erodes the voters' mandate and enables horse trading, uh, against which the anti-defection law was actually brought into place. So the way forward is to have time-bound decisions on the disqualification, ideally by an independent tribunal rather than the speaker himself, and tightening the merger exception and Supreme Court backed timelines to close the loop, loopholes. So from a mains angle, uh, what are the gray areas which are available under the anti-defection law under the 10th schedule to the Constitution, and what is the role of the speaker, and how the discretion of the speaker plays a critical role when it comes to the delaying the decisions or uh, quickening the decisions altogether. And it calls for reforms for effective anti-defection law altogether. Then let us look at the international relations. Japanese Prime Minister Sane Takaichi's first official visit produced at least 16 agreements between India and Japan, including a joint statement on energy resilience along the maritime energy transport value chain, and intend to continue an updated, free and open Indo-Pacific and ring-fencing the bilateral ties between India and Japan from the wider multilateral flux. So the context is with US seen as less enthusiastic about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific framing, India and Japan are deepening the bilateral coordination as a stabilizer amid the uncertainty, especially over the China. So it signals a shift towards minilateralism and issue-based coalitions, especially in energy security, maritime domain awareness, and connectivity between Matarbari on one hand and the Cox's Bazar, insulating the India-Japan cooperation from the fate of larger groupings and anchoring India's Act-East policy and the Northeast to the Bay of Bengal links. So the way forward is to institutionalize the energy resilience and the maritime uh, cooperation and deliver on the connectivity projects and keep the bilateral ties between both the countries robust so that they will act as a hedge irrespective of what's going to be the posture of the US when it comes to the Quad grouping. So now from a mains angle, what we need to see is like what is minilateralism and how minilateralism is playing a critical role amid an shifting US posture, and what are the India and Japan energy and maritime cooperation ties, and the Act East connectivity policy of India. The US Department of the Justice moved to drop all the security fraud charges against Gautam Adani and the associates, citing possible diplomatic strife and saying not a penny has been lost. It framed the 2024 indictment under the FCPA and an Securities and Exchange Commission case as political move by the previous administration. So the context is the 2024 indictments alleged a bribery fraud scheme, and the FCPA targets of foreign corrupt practices with extraterritorial reach. A reversal on the diplomatic grounds injects the foreign policy considerations into a criminal prosecution. So it spotlights how the prosecutorial decisions can shift with change of the political administrations and the bilateral relations. For India, it removes an irritant around the major conglomerate, that is um, Adani's, and but raises the questions about the rule of law consistency and the politicization of the enforcement. So, way forward is to watch for institutional credibility effects, and India's own regulators, like the Securities and Exchange Board of India, continue their processes. And the episode underscores the governance and the disclosure standards for globally exposed conglomerates. From a mains angle, we need to understand law, diplomacy, and business when it comes to India and the international ties, prosecutorial discretion across the different political administrations, and the extraterritorial US law and how it affects the Indian firms. Next, uh, a demand for loyalty from the President Trump puts NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in a difficult position, and it is testing the alliance's cohesion altogether. So NATO's Article 5 talks about the collective defense, which is an attack on one of the members is an attack on all the members of NATO, has been invoked only once and after the 9/11 attacks. NATO rests on collective defense and shared commitment, and framing the alliance in transactional loyalty terms or casting doubts on the US security guarantee strains the cohesion of NATO altogether. So, this reflects a deeper question about the burden sharing and the reliability of the US and the future of the transatlantic alliance, with knock on effects for the security in Europe, defense spending, and the global balance that shapes India's multi-alignment. Uh, uh, multi-alignment. The way forward is strategic autonomy of the Europe on one hand, and the increase in the defense spending are most likely responses from the most of the European countries as the US is backing out. And for India, it's a reminder that the alliance guarantees are contingent in nature, and reinforcing the value of the strategic autonomy and the diversified partnerships are very, very critical for India. So, from mains angle, this is important from What about the cohesion of the international alliances and the burden sharing among the partners, and the reliability of the US on one hand, and the autonomy of the European nations on the other hand? And what are the implications India is going to have for its multi-alignment policy? Then we will look at the science and technology. ISRO has conducted the first ground test on the SOL. SOL means suborbital launch vehicle for experiments, which is a solid motor at the Sriharikota as part of the Gaganyaan. So, as a part of the Gaganyaan qualification framework. So, this human rating campaign involves a 10 parachute deceleration system for safe crew recovery. And the context is Gaganyaan is India's crewed spaceflight program, where the crew safety hinges on the rigorous qualified abort, deceleration, and the recovery systems. And SOLVE offers a suborbital platform to test these experiments. So this marks a steady progress towards the human rating, which is the hardest part of the crewed flight and builds indigenous capabilities in launch recovery and testing. It advances the India's ambitions of Gaganyaan and beyond, like the longer term station for India and the space station for India and the goals with respect to the moon and the space economy of India. So the way forward is complete the test campaign altogether with respect to the parachutes, abort, and the uncrewed missions before the crewed flight, and leverage the technology base for the planned space station and the deep space goals, and thus grow the private sector space ecosystem within India. So from a mains angle, building crewed spaceflight capabilities, safety qualification, India's space economy and ambitions are quite important. Next, we see University of Minnesota researchers are building a synthetic cell that can grow and divide, assembled from a liposome membrane, and it is called as the pure system. And it has 90,000 base pair DNA program, which uses a protein such as the alpha hemolysin and 529 polymerase to sustain the cycle. So the context is to build a minimal and self-replicating cell from the components in the synthetic biology. So this helps in engineering lifelike function from the bottom-up approach rather than modifying the existing organisms. It matters because it deepens the understanding of the minimal requirements of the life and opens applications in medicine, biomanufacturing, and materials. It also sharpens the bioethics and biosafety questions about engineering style replicating systems. So the way forward is strong biosafety and biosecurity governance, and ethical oversight must accompany the science. For India, it argues for investing in the synthetic biology capacity alongside with putting the regulatory safeguards in place. So, from Main's angle, what is the promise of the synthetics biology, and what are the biosafety and bioethics that need to be followed, and how can engineering self-replicating systems be built? And what are the regulatory standards that need to be put in place? Next, let us look at the society and social justice. The National Family Health Survey 6 shows that exclusive breastfeeding had declined from 63.7% to 55.8%, even as women's empowerment indicators are rising. The C-section rates have climbed from 21.5% to 27.5%, and the structural factors such as informal sector work and the weak maternity protection are implicated reasons for this. So, the exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months is cheap and it is high impact intervention for the child survival and nutrition. So, a fall despite rising empowerment is the empowerment paradox. That is, more working women without adequate maternity support or having workplace facilities. So this exposes the gap between the formal rights, which are on paper on one hand, and what is the lived reality. And the Maternity Benefit Act of 1961 covers mainly the formal sector, leaving the informal sector mothers unprotected. So the rising C-sections and the substitute marketing adds pressure on it, and it is maternal and the child health and the gender equity concern. So the way forward is to extend the maternity protection to the informal workers through link like e-strum and enforce the workplace crash and breaks and the the Infant Milk Substitutes Act, and expand the lactation counseling for the mothers. So empowerment and breastfeeding are not in tension. So on one hand, from mains, we can see what the empowerment paradox. That is, on one hand, the women's rights are increasing. There is improvement in the women workforce, but how it is leading to reduction in the exclusive breastfeeding. That is the empowerment paradox. And how to put the maternity protection in place for the informal workers and the decline of the exclusive breastfeeding altogether, which is the greatest guarantee a child has uh, at a cheapest of the cost. Then uh, a gap between the CMFRA landing and data-based assessments and the Food and Agriculture Organization framing official sustainability claims mask the real insured degradation. So India has 64,414 mechanized trawlers, and the territorial sea extends to 12 nautical miles and the exclusive economic zone up to 200 nautical miles. So landing data is about what is caught and what is brought to shore. It can hide the declining stocks and efforts creep near the shore, where the overcapacity concentrates. So the aggregate numbers could look stable while the inshore ecosystems and the small fishers are going to suffer. So this is a livelihood and sustainability crisis. So the overcapacity and the inshore overfishing will threaten the small scale fishers and the coastal ecology because uh, the headline statistics, on the other hand, though they are showing to be good, but the reality is like it is hiding a deeper problem. So, hence, what is required is a science-based stock assessment is required for having a sound policy in place. So, way forward is to shift to the scientific stock assessments and not just the landings, that is what is caught and brought to the shore, and regulate the trawler capacity and the inshore effect and thus protect the small scale fisheries zones and align the management with the exclusive economic zone, the territorial sea governance and conservation. So, from Maine's perspective, the fishery sustainability and the livelihoods, and the data quality and the overcapacity, and how the coastal ecosystems are managed. And we can also look into the Meena Kumari Committee recommendations when it comes to the fisheries and the blue economy. Next, let us look at the internal security and disaster management. So, the piece argues that the tanks remain relevant despite the drones, and while the drones can destroy the targets, but only the ground forces can hold the territory. So, India's Zorawar light tank, which is 25 tons and developed by DRDO and the LNT together, is designed for the line of actual control, high altitude performance, countering China's Type 15 tanks. So, the future ready combat vehicles will replace the aging T-72 tanks. So the recent conflicts showed that the tanks are vulnerable to cheap drones and the ATGMs, prompting the uh, tank is dead claims. But the counter argument is within combined arms warfare, protected mobile firepower still seizes and holds the ground. So it matters because it reframes the debate from obsolescence to adoption. Tanks evolve through active protection, drone integration, and lighter platforms for the terrain rather than disappear completely. And for India, it faces two-front challenge, one from Pakistan and other from the China. And terrain-specific armor is required in terms of light tanks for the line of actual control and the uh, future-ready combat vehicle for the planes. It's a capability priority. So way forward is to invest in the active protection systems and the drone and the counter drone integration and combined arms doctrine and the indigenous platforms like Zorawar and FRCV, which are tailored to the line of actual control and the western front terrains. So the main angle is what is the relevance of the tanks in the drone age, obsolescence of the tanks on one hand, to the adaptation of the tanks to the newer reality of the warfare, and India's dual front needs because of India has a two-front war challenge. Next, we look at in Manipur. Uh, Pangpokpi policemen are being questioned with NIA involvement over the abduction and killing of six Naga men, and this is adding to inter-community dimension to the state's continuing unrest. So the context is Manipur's prolonged Metis Kuki ethnic conflict has strained the institutions, and an incident touching the Naga community risks widening the fault lines and further undermining the trust in the state security forces. It matters because it underscores the fragility of the law and order and the credibility of the impartial investigation in a polarized state. And the accountability of the security personnel is central to restoring the trust across the communities and preventing further spillovers to other states. So the way forward is to have a credible, impartial, and preferably a central agency-led investigation and protect all the communities which are in the war zone and the confidence building measures and the political dialogues towards durable settlement in Manipur. So, from Main's perspective, restoring order and institutional trust in Manipur and the accountability of the security forces and the ethnic conflict management becomes very important. In this context, Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the recommendations made by various committees on the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, especially the Jeevan Reddy Commission, is also equally important. Then, torrential rains have killed three in Maharashtra, and Mumbai had recorded 265.6 mm in 24 hours. And Raigad is having a red alert with IMD issuing color coded warnings. And the intense short duration rainfall increasingly overwhelms the urban drainage and the low lying districts. And this is a pattern consistent with the changing climate and rapid and poorly planned urbanization. So, disaster management and the urban resilience story, where the extreme rainfall exposes the drainage, encroachment, and the preparedness gaps, and the IMD's color alert system is central to the early warning and response. So, way forward is to invest in the urban drainage and the smart city measures, and enforce a floodplain and the wetland protection, and strengthening the early warning uptake and the local response, and the mainstream the climate resilient planning altogether. So, the urban flooding and the climate resilient cities on the one hand, and how to invest in early warning systems when it comes to the floods and the disaster preparedness with respect to the floods. Finally, let us look into history and culture. So, uh, there's an article which revisits the US Declaration of Independence of the 4th July 1776, which was drafted largely by Thomas Jefferson, uh, and which in turn drew on the John Locke's, but replaced property with the pursuit of happiness and asserted the rights as self-evident in nature is a foundational statement of the universal rights. The context is the declaration articulated Enlightenment ideas of the natural rights and the government by consent, becoming a template for the later right charters. Yet it coexisted with the slavery on the other hand. It's a stark contradiction between the universal language of the Declaration of Independence and the exclusionary practice which is done in reality. So, the enduring power of the US Declaration of Independence is that its universal language that all men are created equal outgrew its author's contradictions and later invoked by the abolitionists, the suffragists, and the civil rights movement, and echoing into an universal declaration of the human rights. So, the founding ideals have become tools for later emancipation. So, the lesson for the constitutional democracies is that aspirational rights language sets a standard societies are later held accountable to. In India's context, India's own preamble and the fundamental rights function similarly as evolving promises altogether. That is why the courts time and again have consistently and progressively expanded the definition of the fundamental rights and relied upon the preamble to come up with the new interpretations of the constitution altogether. So, from a mains angle, it shows entitlement rights, the ideas and their contradictions, how the founding ideals drive the later emancipation, and compare and contrast the Declaration of Independence on one hand with India's own constitution. Then, for the mains practice, the questions are climate change is now a livelihood crisis, not an environmental one. Examine with reference to the impact of the heat stress on India's dairy sector. Then, the shift from demand-driven rural employment guarantee to a centrally designed infrastructure scheme raises the questions on the fiscal federalism, critically examined with reference to VBG Ramji replacing Manrega. Then, discuss the grey areas in the 10th schedule of the Constitution that permit the defection despite anti-defection law and suggest reforms. And finally, in the age of drones, tanks have changed their role but not become obsolete. Discuss in the context of India's dual front security challenge. Thank you. That's it for today. We will meet again tomorrow.